Our next speaker is Kristen Sharp, who is co-founder of the Shift Commission, New America. There should be, hopefully.
Okay, thank you. And apologies in advance for not having a PowerPoint presentation. My AI didn't get the message. So my name is Kristen Sharp. I run the Work, Workers, and Technology program at the think tank New America, which is a DC-based but think tank that operates at the intersection of technology and policy, but that operates throughout the country, and in particular on this topic is looking at how automation is impacting the future of work for workers in particular places. We first started doing this work about 2 years ago when we brought together policymakers, technologists, AI specialists, and workers across the country to think about what the future of work looks like 15 to 20 years from now. And we did this because we were specifically considering this question of whether or not new opportunities will be created to replace the opportunities that are going away, and what that will look like. So I always like to start the discussion off by just doing a visual on what the group thinks about that. So if you could please raise your hand if you think that automation, artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, data-connected system will, over the course of the next 15 to 20 years, create new opportunities for most workers in the United States. Okay, or will create challenges for most workers in the United States. You can say yes to both of those, but it's interesting to see sort of what the breakdown is in different contexts of educators versus technologists, and interesting that in a group of mostly educators and people who specifically are educating the next generation of computer scientists, that this comes across as a potential challenge. So we did, over the course of the year or so that we had these conversations, conducted a series of nationwide conversations across sectors looking at this question, and ended up with we ran people through economic scenario planning, where we had them really design the stories of what they think the future of work looks like 15 years from now, and do it as if they were writing the movie script or the visual of what we think that looks like. And it ended up, after doing this over and over and over again with a number of sets of leaders across the country, that we got probably between 40 and 50 different stories. And from that, we're able to aggregate what the categories of work were that leaders across the United States thought were the most likely to come out. And that we ended up with about 4 different types of categories of work that people thought were emerging, despite the fact that we have all of the technological change that's happening. And those were creative lifestyle jobs, which is anything that enhances human-to-human interaction, coaching, teaching, elder care and child care, healthcare, foodie and fitness, travel, tourism, things that connect people with one another and are jobs based around the fact that you are enhancing someone's interaction in some way. 2, we saw a lot of things that were related to specialization and specific trainings into jobs that corporations are seeing a dearth of workers in right now. So that was things that were curricula that were designed by employer-led or specific just lack of workers that could do a particular thing. And we saw a number of different kinds of corporations setting up their own training programs, working with education, community colleges in particular, to get to the kinds of workers that they want to do. So that was employer-led. The third category that came up over and over again is freelance work, and work where people are having a portfolio of different kinds of skills and using their skills and that portfolio of skills to create a collection of income sources. And finally, the kinds of things that come up repeatedly when we talk about this, jobs around AI, around coding and software development, and around the digital versions of existing jobs. And so the digital versions of existing jobs means truckers to the people who are monitoring and deploying the pelotons of self-driving trucks and looking at the sort of logistics of loading and unloading the stuff at both entry and exit points. So the thing that was interesting about seeing those 4 categories laid out was that the basic point that they all had in common was that they were all self-directed jobs in some way. They were all jobs where the worker, him or herself, had to figure out what they wanted to do, figure out what it was why it was important, figure out how to connect to the skills or education that made that a good job, and then sort of brand themselves and tell people why it was important that they do that, what the value add was. And that is a very different way of thinking about work than we think about it right now. Right now, if you think about what a job is or what your own job is, it does a couple basic things. It provides the continuity. Most people expect that once they get a job, they have that job until they quit or get fired from it, but it goes on a continuing basis. Two, that there's a pathway to advancement, and that seniority and advancement sort of go in a linear path, and you continue advancing in either the job or the industry that you're working in. And finally, that the skills that you have at the beginning of your career will continue to be relevant throughout your career. And all of those expectations may or may not be changing as a result of the new advances in technologies that we're seeing. So one of the things that came up repeatedly when we were having conversations around the country was, how does this impact people on the ground? How does this impact people that aren't in the sort of educated world that Moshe described? And so we wanted to take this conversation to cities around the country that were small or mid-sized cities and see about what people were thinking on automation. And we found that our first 3 pilot cities were Indianapolis, Phoenix, and Detroit. And we found in having conversations with people that most people are not worried that robots are taking their jobs, because they're not thinking about how automation and AI are impacting their daily lives. They see it happening with GPS and with Uber having GPS and with, hear about drones and those kinds of things, but they're not, most people are thinking about the jobs that they're already doing and not thinking about how those jobs are evolving over the course of the next 10 or 15 years. And so we found that just setting the stage and talking about the awareness of what's, these major trends that are coming was an important thing to do in a lot of communities around the country. So our Shift Labs program, which is the program that is working with communities to develop experimental programs to connect workers with new jobs, goes in and evaluates the automation risk of a particular city. So it looks at the top employing jobs in that city and how many people are employed in the top sort of 10 or 20 jobs in that city, and then talks about what percentage of those jobs are at risk of not just elimination as a result of automation, which is what most people talk about, but also the risk of significant change as a result of automation. We've talked a lot today about how jobs are at risk and how particular kinds of jobs are at risk, but in addition to that being the case, there's a breakdown of different kinds of tasks that operate within each kind of job. And it isn't necessarily that X kind of thing will just go away. It's that it will change so significantly that particularly people with low and middle skilled jobs won't be eligible for the new versions of those jobs. And so thinking very carefully about how to connect people with the kinds of opportunities that will go forward is sort of the question that comes up for all of us over and over again. The interesting thing about having community-led conversations about this was that sort of in stark contrast to the fact that most of the kinds of jobs we're seeing emerge are self-driven in some way, the number one thing that people say in surveys and in focus groups and in discussions of sort of community pilot programs are that they want economic stability. They want to know that they're going to be paid on the 1st and 15th of every month, and that job will continue indefinitely. And that's not the kind of jobs that we're seeing emerge right now. And so the question for all of us, I think, as we're having this discussion, is what are the new and creative ways that we can think about to provide economic stability if it doesn't come from your job going forward? And I know that Scott will talk about one of the particular examples of that, universal basic income, but there are others that we should think about, and in particular, thinking about how to infuse a sense of entrepreneurialism and a sense of problem solving into every kind of job that's out there, every educational curriculum, everything that we're doing to connect workers to new opportunities, and in thinking about the connections that people have to one another as they're connecting to new things. So thinking about coaching and helping workers specifically identify the networks, build their capacity, identify the skills that they need, and figure out how to create a situation where their skills and interests generate income in some way. So I think I'll stop there because it generally ends up to be interesting to have questions on this topic, and would love to sort of hear the reaction from folks. So, thank you.
Kristen, I don't have a well-formed question on this, but maybe you have a thought on this. I've been kind of curious about the previous presenters' slides, particularly on men and the decline in working age men, prime age working age men not working. But we also know that there is a divide in higher education enrollment now. You know, women largely make up a much larger proportion of higher education enrollment. At the same time, we know from the work Michelle has been doing at Strata and the most recent report that they came out with on underemployment that women tend to be more underemployed than men. We also know that men tend to be dominant in the STEM fields, women tend to be dominant in the healthcare fields, which are all growing. I guess one of the things that I'm kind of curious about is looking at this of the prism through the gender divide, because we also know that comes up in politics a lot. Any thoughts on that? Again, I don't have a well-formed question on this, but I'm trying to pull all this data together, which really shows these very stark gender divides in an age when, you know, we think that there's more, and I know there isn't, there's more equality in the workforce.
So that is a great question, Jeff, and I didn't plant him, but it really leads to a lot of the findings that we've seen in analyzing the automation risk in particular places around the country. And one of the things that we've been most interested in, most surprised to find, is that there is a huge automation risk to women. And in particular, when people talk about the workers who are most at risk for automation, you automatically think of logistics, manufacturing, and trucking. Those are sort of the big three that get cited as things that are going to be automated away in short order. But honestly, there's retail workers, cashiers, and administrative and office workers that are equally at risk, and those are jobs that are primarily held by women. And so we're likely to see an onslaught of people who are facing significant risk in those kinds of jobs. My own personal theory about why that's the case is that a lot of the jobs that have historically employed men are jobs that are big categories of jobs. So our system of training people right now is training 100,000 people or 300,000 people for one kind of job. And we actually need to move to a system at this point where we're training 3 people for 100,000 different kinds of jobs, and we don't have a process and a system for that. But women's jobs have historically been a little bit more individualized and a little bit more one-off in some ways, particularly in the healthcare and in the childcare fields. And so I think that it hasn't come up as a big set of categories as much as it has for men, but that there is a real potential problem, particularly in the sort of loan processors, healthcare coding fields, office administration, things that provide a $30,000 to $50,000 job that can, in fact, be a woman's support for her family. So. You know, people cite the bank teller job as an example a lot, and it's a great example because in the 1980s, and what he's talking about is in the 1980s, many people thought that bank tellers would be automated away as a result of ATMs. But the fact that because every bank wanted to put a stop on the corner because they had ATMs. There ended up being many, many more banking sites, and there were more tellers that just did different things besides take the money back and forth. But that's actually now changing. That there are now some of the jobs that the bank tellers transitioned to after ATMs are in fact going away. So it's you never know how that's going to turn out.
So I guess it feels like there's a lot of different jobs that are going to go away. There's new types of jobs that are going to be created for this education crowd that creates a massive retraining opportunity. What I'm curious about is, did you look at the demographics as you went into these cities? Because pretty much both all the developed economies and many of the emerging economies, in fact, most of them, have big demographic challenges. And while I agree with Moshe about participation rate is definitely the more important number to look at than unemployment, we're not going to be able to keep the lights on, right? So if we didn't have these new technologies coming, our economies would collapse for demographic reasons. So how much have you factored that in? And where I'm going here is, you know, we're in all these past transitions, there was actually a surplus of labor during the transition, and things were bad, and as Moshe said, it took a phenomenally awful amount of time to get through it, but there were surpluses of labor. The thing that's really different about this transition is it's happening coincident with this demographic drop. We're not actually going to have enough workers. So so every retraining is going to be critical. So did you factor that in, and how did that factor into your thinking?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. We didn't factor it in specifically to the analysis because we operate on a 10 to 15 year time frame. But you're right, in that time frame, my generation, Gen X, is sort of many fewer people than the baby boomer generation, but the millennials behind me and Gen Z behind that are on the upswing. So it might be a situation where we have sort of up and down. In terms of automation, in countries that have dramatically aging populations, South Korea and Japan primarily, they have had rapid and enthusiastic adoption of automation in different ways, and it's been primarily a good thing because they haven't had the workers, but they also have fewer women in the labor force and a number of other factors. But it's a good question and a good thing to think about as we go forward. Yes.
So 3 real quick things. The reading I've done, or the reading I've seen on bank tellers, is more complicated because the nature of what the bank teller did is very different than bank tellers in the past. And you go into a bank and all the folks lined up around to give you loans and do things that bank tellers didn't do. So I think part of that is caught up in that. Banks found a new business strategy and so forth. Second, there is probably this phenomenon, like this gentleman was speaking about, in truck driving. They anticipate $100,000, a relatively important $100,000 person lack of truck drivers in the near future because of the demographic, the age of the truck drivers, and nobody wants to go into truck driving because they know it's not going to be a very sustainable job. So I think there'll be it's going to be an interesting adjustment process because of things like that. And then the last thing, because it hasn't been mentioned in any of the discussions today, as difficult as we think about things in the context of the U.S. economy, if we think about them in the context of developing countries, all of our textiles are made in Vietnam and Bangladesh, and soon they won't be. And so it's even a more potentially more disruptive for countries like that.
Yes, true. On your first point, it's an interesting question, and we get that question a lot about trucking, particularly because much of the workforce development board sort of structure, we spend a lot of money on connecting people with CDLs right now, which is the trucking license, and thinking about the short-term gap in not having enough people, but the longer-term gap that we won't need them is a big issue and a big question. And when we look at it, we tend to look at over the course of how are we preparing people over the course of 15 years for things that will be sustainable and money-generating jobs, so that they don't get to be age 35 or 40 at the midpoint of their career and not have someplace to go.